The way I always put this down is like your brain is a problem-solving machine, all right? If it doesn't have a problem to work on, it's got nothing to do. So if you don't have a broader issue like how can we prune faster, how can we set this vineyard up in a better way, then it's going to go, oh, I wonder why you said that thing to that person, right? Or I wonder why blah, blah, blah.
And then ruminate.
And just because it's a problem-solving machine doesn't mean it gives you good answers, all right? It goes kind of like a smorgasbord. I've got this issue, I could do all of these different things. And then you're kind of left kind of ruminating and just whirling around all the options of what I might do about this problem that, it exists, but it may not be at the top of the priority list.
In today's episode, we're joined by Dr Ian Zajac, a senior research scientist at the CSIRO and director of MensPsych Psychology Services in Adelaide, where he works as a clinical psychologist. Ian specialises in men's mental health and has a unique insight to share as both a researcher and clinician.
Welcome to Healthy Minds, Healthy Vines, the wellbeing podcast for growers, proudly brought to you by the Wine Grape Council of South Australia, sponsored by Perza, hosted by
journalist and award-winning mental health podcaster Callum McPherson,
and columnist for The Australian and the World of Fine Wine and Australia's leading wine writer when sold by the kilo, Nick Ryan. Let's crush this.
Ian, you double as a clinical psych and a researcher. How's that shaped the way that you view mental health?
It kind of shapes it in the sense that I like to try and stay across, I guess, what's going on from a research perspective in terms of understanding what's driving mental health difficulties, but also what we can do about them, and then kind of leveraging that from a science into a practice model. So it kind of gives me a hand in both sides of it so that I can sort of stay abreast of everything that's going on in both areas.
And you're working at the treatment end, but also a lot in preventative health as well.
Yeah.
Why does prevention need more attention in your view?
Prevention is really critical at the top level in terms of reducing the burden of disease or burden of mental health. So in the first instance, you think about what suffers when someone is in a full-blown mental health crisis. So you'll get more days off work, you'll get more hospital admissions, you'll get a higher use of just general medical services. So at a cost level, as soon as someone is at that point, it kind of gets expensive from a government perspective. But before you get to that level, most people sort of go through a transitionary period where you might, for instance, be struggling more and not quite at a threshold where you'd want to take some sort of action. And in that sort of intervening period, you can damage friendships, you can damage relationships, you might make impulsive decisions about work or other things. And so prevention is both about reducing costs, but from my perspective, also about reducing the influence of what's going on in terms of how you're engaging with life and what you do. So by thinking more about prevention, we can sort of just wind back those effects as much as possible.
But there hasn't been much of a focus on prevention traditionally compared to the treatment side of things, or certainly funding-wise. 99% of the funding goes towards treatment, which is obviously crucial, but there's the preventative side of things. Stopping it getting to that point in the first place would obviously lessen that burden. So it seems like there needs to be more focus all the way along there rather than right at the crisis point.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at the prevention literature, a lot of it is couched in kind of the well-being space. So what keeps people healthy? And we know that what keeps people healthy is also good at preventing a decline into a kind of disordered space. But I think the challenge has been bridging that knowledge into solutions. It's so variable across people, kind of what works in terms of keeping you well and keeping you well, that when we at a research level, we're looking at broad populations and we try and decide, we put you two in the same group and we go, what's the average between you? That's what'll work. And so when you roll it out and I deliver an intervention around prevention, you might take it up and you might go, well, it's not for me. So it gets tricky at that level because it's super individualized. And I think we need to move more towards segmenting groups of people and finding out what works. And even if it's 1 million people in Australia, not everyone, you can still have quite a big impact. So it's really around multiple offerings in a prevention context so that people can kind of pick and choose or be led into different offerings that are going to be useful for them, rather than, we don't like doing things that don't work. So you don't want to end up, doing a program or using a digital solution or even seeing someone if there's no gain out of it. So it's kind of trial and error, but has to really be personalised and targeted.
Yeah, so it'd be a lot easier if it was one size fits all, but
100%.
doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no one's like that. It just can't. And I guess what we're talking about too, we're talking to great growers in a particular industry, and who are invariably regionally based, spending a lot of time sort of reasonably isolated and working in vineyards. So what's going to work for them isn't necessarily what's going to work for someone with an office-based job in town, and vice versa.
100%. And that's the challenge. It's it might be a local-based solution. It could be a demographic-based solution. It could be a statewide solution. But at that point, it's kind of driving to what's a pertinent issue for this segment, and how do we address that? And that's where consumer-led kind of design is really important. So from a research perspective, rather than me go, an app to connect, grape growers is a really cool thing, and I roll it out, and all your mates go, well, that's ridiculous. We come to you and we say, what's going to work for you guys? Like, what's going on? What are the issues? How disconnected are you? And how do we foster that reconnection, for example? And how do you want to do it?
Yep.
Because, being offered solutions that aren't ground up in terms of development just doesn't really work.
Yeah.
So the solutions are different, but in terms of the main issues mental health wise, what's most prevalent in Australia?
In terms of disorders, for instance? Yeah, so the most common disorders in the National Survey on Mental Health and Wellbeing, it's just been released again, that puts affective disorders, so mood disorders, depressive episodes, bipolar, those sorts of things, anxiety disorders, generalised social phobia, agoraphobia, those kind of disorders, and then substance use disorders. So they're the three kind of highest categories of prevalence in Australia, and mostly globally as well.
What do men tend to struggle with most?
If you look at the latest data, so women are higher on affective disorders and higher on anxiety disorders, and guys are higher on substance use disorders. And that's across the age range. And it's probably even across kind of urban and regional areas as well. Men tend to leverage substance use more so as a coping mechanism, and I think it kind of spirals, and then you end up with a dependence, or just not necessarily a dependence, but you're using it as a scapegoat. And so that's where the substance use disorder kind of
And that
kicks through.
substance abuse will commonly be connected to depression most often?
Yeah.
Or trauma?
Well, I think you just put it, I always put that down to distress, because everything's so comorbid. So if you're depressed, you tend to be more anxious as well. Yeah. So you might withdraw as a result of depressive symptoms. So you're less motivated, less energetic, less interested. And then when you invite me over for a barbie, I'm like, oh, I don't really know how I'm going to show up. I might look like a dickhead or whatever. And so, you go, well, which one's an issue? And it's like both. So I just kind of go, is the individual distressed or not? And then when you are, as we know, guys tend to leverage substance use. They tend to get more aggressive, tend to be more risky in terms of behaviour. They tend to suppress their emotions a lot more. And so, they're the indicators that we look for in terms of whether someone is struggling to cope or not.
And I guess those are the things that you can look for in yourself and in 100%. Your mates as well.
Yeah.
Because men typically, we're great at hiding it, we're great at making it look like we're fine, because obviously that's part of the stigma, part of being tough, part of that understanding of what it means to be a man, and like, don't show emotion, don't let anyone see that there's anything going on underneath the surface. But inevitably it does come out and manifest in certain ways, like you just mentioned, with aggression, with feeling anxious and then having to express it. So there's those things that we can be on the lookout for. People withdrawing, not talking as much as they used to, not wanting to come to social occasions.
Definitely.
Stuff that might seem like nothing.
Yeah.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah, and I think it's a slow but slippery slope. And it's often, I often think it's more difficult for the individual who's experienced a heightened level of distress to go, okay, I'm drinking a bit more than I used to, or I'm, not going out as much as I used to, because you kind of just end up there.
Yeah.
And that's where your network of people becomes really important to go, I haven't seen Callum for ages, or, we're down the pub and he's just binge drinking all the time. Like, I think people who are external can see that change in behaviour a lot more than the individual themselves.
Yeah, and how do you acknowledge when it's actually becoming a problem as well?
Yeah, and I guess I think, there's this added layering of complexity when we're talking about people, working in viticulture, because your day-to-day job is the production of something, an end product that 100%. Can be abused. And I know, working in wine for a long time, I've become a lot more conscious of, of my drinking and how, I think about it more, and I have to make some sort of controlled decisions, about it, because I am, that's the world I operate in, and it's very hard to sort of remove yourself from something if it's a problem.
Yeah.
When that is your day-to-day work.
To an extent.
Yeah, and it's part of that social expectation as well, right? And I find when I work with people who are using alcohol a lot, that's really one of the hardest things to shift, because it's so socially accepted and expected on many occasions. So if you go to the footy and you usually have a few beers, or you guys catch up, on a weekend and you have a few wines, and then you go there and you don't, because usually, if you're in that crux, you want to try and jump the complete opposite direction.
Yeah.
People are like, what's going on? So you're kind of going out wearing a big white flag, and then you don't know how to answer those conversations when people are like, what's going on with you?
Yeah.
If it's not the environment and the type of conversation for you to go, well, I'm not drinking at the moment because I've got an alcohol use issue, for example.
And we don't want to have that conversation or have people say to us, oh, why aren't you drinking?
Yeah.
So what can you think of something that's just an easy way to palm that off and just be straight up about it? Or
I always encourage just open honesty. Like if you're struggling with that at the moment, you either come out and you say, I'm just not drinking for the next whatever, or I'm not drinking anymore, or I have issues, I'm having issues with alcohol consumption, so I'm not doing it anymore.
Yeah.
I think it also depends on how close a relationship you have with people. So, we don't want to disclose heaps of information to random groups or people we just meet. And so sometimes some people I work with might go, oh, I'm doing like a 30-day challenge, or, which is, you're kind of hiding the bigger issue, but you're also more likely to not get the, comments around just having a drink or whatever else it is.
Yeah. So you can see there'll be a lot of people, working in this industry that, there'll be, there's a tasting at work, and the job is actually having to, make some critical decisions about a bunch of wines on the table. And if you're struggling with your drinking at the time, that's going to be pretty confronting and hard to manage.
Definitely. And I think, that's where we end up a bit stuck. And so often, if you're working with someone who has an issue with alcohol consumption, like they're leveraging it as a kind of emotional control or avoidance thing, it's like what looks more like how you want to engage in that behavior. So for your example, it might be, if I'm at work and there's a tasting and we're blending, or it's a new vintage or whatever, I'll partake in that, but I'm not then going to, stay around for 2 hours and knock back another 3 glasses of wine. And I think even those gradual shifts help people move back towards like either finding better ways to cope with the distress and leveraging some unhelpful behaviors. But it also helps you feel a bit more in control of it, because you're kind of having small wins.
Are there things that employers can do to sort of help facilitate that? It can't be easy to go to an employer and say, look, I'm struggling at the moment, would rather sort of avoid some of these situations. Do employers have to have a sort of a no judgment position and be able to identify these things and find out ways they can help?
Yeah, look, I think employers who are like embedded in that industry, for example, should have a strategy or a workplace policy or some sort around how they kind of try to monitor and engage with staff around that, because, it becomes permissible, it's part of the daily job, and it's a slippery slope. So you need to be able to identify it. In terms of as an employee, I think I'd love to say that we should all just be able to go out and disclose, whatever's going on for us, and that there should be no repercussions.
Easier said than done, though.
100%. But I do think there comes a point where you go, if I don't do that, like if I don't go out and say to my employer, like I can't participate in the tastings or blendings at the moment for this reason, and the employer goes, well,
what good are you to us?
What good are you? What are you standing for? Are you going to stand for what's important for you in terms of where you're at and what you need, or are you going to kind of be pushed around by that drive? And there's probably some compromise. It might be I'm doing this for 6 months. Just to get on top of things, and then I'm back into that. So it's really just around, again, fostering that open communication where possible, but you've got to have good relationships to do it.
Yeah.
And Ian, once we're diagnosed with a mental illness, does that mean that we then have it for life?
If you, for instance, are bipolar or autistic or an ADHD, that's lifelong, and you'll bounce around as a result of it, depending on what the disorder is. If you have had a previous depressive episode and you have a diagnosis of depression, it means that you're more likely to have one again in the future, but the period between them might be 10 years, 6 months, so it's not that you're constantly impacted by that burden of symptoms. It sort of dips in, you get quite seriously depressed, and then gradually come out of that. So it's really individual. On the short answer is, if you've had a mental health disorder, you are more likely to face those challenges again in some form. But it doesn't mean there aren't really good periods of stability or improvement in between them.
Because I imagine those labels could be counterproductive at times where someone might not seek help or go see a psychologist because they don't want to be painted with that brush. They don't want to come forward and say, I think I've got this problem, and then have that confirmed and then think, okay, now I'm someone who's mentally ill forever, and that's how I'll be known and that's how I know myself.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to be able to reframe it and not look at it that way.
Yeah. Look, I've seen people who have said to me that that's one of the reasons why they didn't come forward, or why they had a few conversations with their GP around preparing a care plan under Medicare, for example. But we're blessed in Australia in that, that health record doesn't link into insurance. It's not accessible by an employer. There are some industries, I guess, where it's probably more relevant to disclose something like that than not. But in others, we have sick leave to cover periods where we're unwell. And if it's not going to have a significant detrimental impact on your work performance, like across time, then you're kind of in that position about whether I disclose it or not, but also whether employers should know about it or not.
I guess one of the benefits of COVID is that it seems our society has gotten a fair bit more accepting of that in the last few years, but I guess how much of that is virtue signalling and appearing to do the right thing versus actually meaning it.
Yeah. And I guess it's part of the human experience to, sometimes feel a bit shit.
Definitely.
But so where is it, how do we recognise that, we're just a bit flat, just not feeling great, to, that next step where we actually have a problem and probably need to seek some help?
Yeah. I mean, there's this diagnosis called an adjustment disorder, which kind of lends to what you're talking about, where maybe something happens or some things have changed, and you kind of have this period of time where you're maybe you're flat, you're not coping as well as you used to, and maybe it's having a few impacts here or there, but it's fairly time bound, and with support you might correct out of that and never end up back there again.
Yep.
But in terms of whether it's disordered, and I say disordered because there's a lot of negative language around even that term, it's when it's like significantly impacting on your life. So when we look at a disorder and say diagnosis or not, we're looking at whether this is clinically significant. So is the individual not engaging in work? Are they staying in bed? Are they, significantly leveraging substance, for example? Yeah. Are they driving dangerously? And at that point, when it's really serious, the consequences of it, then technically that's when we say, that's disordered. But I mean, the most recent data showed that around 25% of people engage in therapy and they're not disordered. So it's this real kind of blend. And I think that reflects kind of what you're talking about here, where some people maybe just feeling not the best, or maybe they're having relational strain or some other issue.
And that's going to be a lot of us, where you're languishing in the middle there. So there's feeling really good, and then there's having a mental disorder, and then say most of us are in the middle somewhere most of the time, and then you might move up and down that spectrum as well. Because I think another misconception is that you're either mentally ill or you're absolutely fine.
Perfect.
And there's sort of nothing in between.
Be nice to be one,
but of course,
fine all the time.
Yeah, but it's that spectrum.
Yeah. And there's a few kind of theories out there that put down the human experience as being one of a difficulty. Some people use the term suffering. I don't ascribe to the suffering part, but it is difficult. Like, each day brings something new, life challenges change, life stages change. We're all going to adapt and react to those differently, depending on how well we cope with stress, also depending on how well connected we are and kind of other coping mechanisms that we have. So, you know, inevitably we're going to face times in life where we're not doing that well. And then the question is, well, am I not doing, you know, am I doing so bad that I need support? And some people go quite early to seek professional input, and some people don't. Some people never go.
And I'm guessing it's the case that it's easier to help people if they seek help earlier on rather than when they're at the point where they're right on the cusp or they're really struggling.
I think if you can help people earlier on, you'll prevent more damage being done. Sometimes earlier on, you know, if it's, let's say you're out of work all of a sudden, then sometimes we're dealing with kind of systemic and environmental factors around an individual that you can't have a direct influence on. You know, if I lost my job yesterday, I can't just get it replaced tomorrow. But what it does is help kind of frame what's going on in a different way so that an individual works out where they're going to, how I can get there and do it better than when you're, for instance, in a really high level of distress and you come into clinic, then we might be talking more about how you're getting through the day. You know, can we get out of bed a little bit earlier and what would we do? So they're very different modes of intervention and support, both obviously beneficial, of course. And I think the prevention one is probably more likely to translate across lots of different contexts.
Yeah.
Can you spend too much time in your own head? You know, I'm thinking of, you know, people out there pruning vineyards and, you know, it's a quite solitary, you know, insular kind of thing. And, you know, you're spending days and days and days on end, you know, out
It's a
there on your
dangerous place
own.
to be.
Yeah. So the way I always put this down is like your brain is a problem-solving machine, all right? If it doesn't have a problem to work on, it's got nothing to do. So if you don't have a broader issue like how can we prune faster, how can we set this vineyard up in a better way, then it's going to go, oh, I wonder why you said that thing to that person, right? Or I wonder why blah, blah, blah.
And then ruminate.
And just because it's a problem-solving machine doesn't mean it gives you good answers, all right? It goes kind of like a smorgasbord. I've got this issue, I could do all of these different things. And then you're kind of left kind of ruminating and just whirling around all the options of what I might do about this problem that, you know, it exists, but it may not be at the top of the priority list. It's just that you've had a lot of time to think about a particular thing. So you definitely can spend too much time in your head. And I think, you know, using activities like podcasts and music and other things to just give your brain something to churn away on is actually really useful because, as I said, if it's got nothing to do, it's not there to go, hey man, you're having a great life. It's there to go, shit, you know, there's something wrong here. Let's go and work out what the problem is.
Yep.
And sometimes actually just speaking it out loud is how we work it out. So it might not be the fact that the person that you choose to share some stuff with is actually going to solve the problem. In pretty much every case they won't. But it's just speaking it out loud.
Self-editing.
And when you talk, you're like, oh, that doesn't actually make much sense.
Yeah.
Or that doesn't really fit the way that I thought it did when I've been ruminating on it.
Yeah.
And it's just that act of actually speaking it out where we sort of figure it out for ourselves. But if we're just locking ourselves away or we're isolated and keeping those thoughts to ourselves constantly, not letting anyone else in with any other perspective, stuff can start to really not make sense. We won't even particularly notice.
That's right. And we'll find minor things that might always have been there, like in a relationship, for instance, where it's like, oh, you know, my partner's been doing this and it's a real reason why we're not compatible. It's like 3 months ago, that was just no big deal, you know, and that's like what you're saying. So when you do talk it out, you do get some context to put it within and go, actually, you know, that's actually not as big a deal as my brain's made it out to be. Or it's something that we can take steps to address. So the mind is a dangerous place, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
And on the extreme end, 9 Aussies per day die by suicide. 7 of them are men.
Yeah.
What are the largest contributing factors to that?
If you go through the data and look at the leading contributors, the first is a pre-existing mental health condition, and that could be diagnosed or not. And I think quite often in men, it's probably not. I think that it's still a driver of suicide in that context. And so we need to get better at identifying that that's actually happening before we get to that point. Relational strain is one of the next biggest factors, so particularly relationship breakdown, and then kind of relationship strain while you still exist within it. So they're kind of the top 3.
And particularly for men with the relationship or both?
It's hard to say. you look at the data and you go, well, it's a particular issue for men because men comprise the vast majority of suicides. But, overall, I think it probably drives on both sides of the coin. Like, I think if women are in a relationship that's not going so well, they're probably going to be in a similar space with regards to stress and even suicidality. And I think with men, the issue is it tends to be kept quiet for a long time, to the point that with that problem-solving brain, it's like, what can we do about it? And you find a solution, and you just go through with the solution rapidly. So I think, when we're looking at what do we do about drivers of suicide, we think first and foremost about like keeping an eye out for mates or for people we know in terms of suffering, thinking about it in the context of what's going on. So if you had a relationship breakdown and we were good mates, I'm going to check in with you about it, right? If you lose your job, I'm going to check in with you about it, especially if we're 2 months post it and you haven't even got a new job yet, and I've noticed you're not coming out to see me, you don't text me, or...
It's just about not assuming that everything's fine, or not taking the way that person in your life has responded at face value. Like, okay, they said they were fine immediately after the fact, so they must just be fine, and that's all good. Yeah. But it can take even more balls from both sides, I guess, to continue to check in and continue to do something as simple as go around and hang out with them or give them a phone call months afterwards. Compared to when it's just happened, but that can be just as important.
Yeah, I think we flock around people when things just happen, and then it kind of tapers off. And I think the conversations need to be more like, hey, Callum, how you been going, right? And you're like, yeah, good. And I'm like, yeah, but, I know this stuff has happened, so I'm a bit worried about that. I just want to check in. Like, we tend not to go to the next point. Like you said, we take it on face value, and we go, I've done my part.
Because it's uncomfortable to go that bit further. But then 100%. You don't get anywhere either if you don't.
That's right. And I think just call it out. It's like, how you going looking for work? It's been a few months, or I've been worried about you because I noticed you kind of, binge drinking a lot, or you're not coming out, and just like throw the question out there.
Yeah, it's a process, not a single act. So you always got to keep re-engaging.
And go back to it, especially like you said, 3 months down the track. And I've had this in my personal life with people I know where I've called in on a mate and said, how are you going with this? And I've said, are you actually feeling good in yourself, or have you thought, maybe about hurting yourself? And they've gone, yeah, actually, and it's been a complete nightmare in my brain. But if we didn't push into the topic, then, we don't get answers. And I think there's like an old mindset that if we talk about particularly suicide, then we make it worse.
We don't talk about suicide enough, and you'll read a news report of, something that's clearly a suicide, and there won't be any mention of it until there'll be a little lifeline, caption at the end of the report.
And the thinking there is that if people read about suicide, it's going to trigger them to then potentially do it themselves.
Yeah. Look, I think there's safe reporting when you're putting an article out to millions of people that we need to be cautious of. But if I know you well, right, then I should step into that space. If you are a good mate to me, I'm going to do that. If I don't do that, well, A, I either don't know how to do it, which is true for a lot of people, or B, I'm not a good mate, right? And I think the conversations are really difficult to have, both if you're the person in distress and if you're not. And generally speaking, like men and women, we tend to, how's everything going? Yeah, it's good, it's fine. And then we stop the conversation. We don't sit around and stay on the topic. So we're not actually very well
sometimes
practiced.
It's appropriate and sometimes it's not as well, depending 100%. On the context and where you are. And, if you've got an inkling that there might be more to that story, but there's a bunch of other people around and it's not the time for it, then you've got to pick and choose your moments still.
Yes. And I think that's where, if you go down to, a family barbecue and everyone's running around and kids are running around and you're all at the table with 10 people having lunch, you're not just going to call out someone and go, hey, I'm really worried about this, unless you're all very close. But if you wander off, inside later and I go get a drink and I pull you aside and say, hey, I've been worried about this, how you going with it? That's where we've got to think about when is an appropriate time for sure, and make the appropriate time where you can.
I lost a mate to suicide, and just about everyone I know has been touched in some way by suicide. I'm sure in some way it's touched both of your lives. That's the same old story for most. For me, and again for most people, you hear the same old thing, I had no idea. I would never have expected that to happen. It's just about always a real shock.
Yeah.
But then in hindsight, you look back and the signs were there. What do we often miss along the way that results in us just being so shocked? I mean, I don't think we'd ever expect people to go to that extent, but what are things that we often miss?
Yeah. I think we miss picking up on what we see in people, right? Because humans are conversational. So if I ask you if you're doing okay and you say yes, I'm going to take that. But if I see you doing things that you don't usually do, or withdrawing, whatever it is, we touched on a few things, then I don't need the conversation to tell me that you're not okay. All right. I know you're not okay. You may not be suicidal, but you're definitely not how you were. And that's kind of what we need to think about pushing into. And when it comes to suicide, I think I definitely think there's cases where you have absolutely zero idea, right? 100%, I think that's true. But I think there's a lot of cases where, like you said, if you look back, you go, actually, there's kind of a couple of things here and a couple of things there. I didn't register, but that's because we're not well practiced at looking out for those signals. And then we're not practiced at having a conversation around them.
If you haven't experienced suicide before in your own life, you're just not going to see those things, I think, most of the time. Yeah. But in my own personal case, after that happened to a mate, there've been other times since with other friends, a handful of other friends, where I have seen those signs and have picked up on them and they have been serious. And because I was looking out for it and I'm involved in this space, was able to see that and then be there for those people. But it just is so scary, I think, for men in particular, how great we are at hiding it. And how final men are about suicide as well, where we'll just go off and we'll just do it.
And you see a lot of times when there's suicide in the family or something, people don't necessarily acknowledge that that's that's what's happened, and it's it's couched in all sorts of ambiguous language
associated with it. Yeah.
And is there almost a responsibility for the people that have experienced that to be a bit more open and able to talk about it?
Well, if mental health is a leading driver of suicide, and for particular disorders, they can be highly genetic, then within a family, I do think we need to talk about that. We need to be open about that for sure.
And half of all suicides in 2020 were people within the age bracket of 30 to 60. That'll be just about all our listeners for this podcast. Why do you think it's so prevalent within that age range?
Yeah, it's an interesting statistic, because if you look at the prevalence of mental health difficulties, right, it's highest in that kind of 16 to early 20 group. And then, it's still elevated throughout, but you go, well, if suicide rates are highest in this block, that midlife, and supposed mental health disorders are lower than, the younger there, then what's going on, right? I think more and more, as everyone would probably recognize, we tend to have more conversations about mental health. It's more out in the open. There's this term, the lost generation, that I've heard in clinical circles a few times, where there's adults, you say my age, I'm 40, and when I was at school, there was very little recognition of neurodevelopmental disorders, for instance, like ADHD and autism. There was little recognition of the early indicators of mental health difficulties in kids. So we kind of flew through the school system. Then we went out into the world, got bounced around a bit like we talked about before, and get to a point where I guess either you've repeatedly suffered or there's been a big change in circumstances and you can't cope with it, that, maybe that is part of the driving factor there. And I think, generally there's changes over that period as well. You might be in a family, so you lose less connection with friends, for instance, because you spend a lot of time with that. That's not to say that's a bad thing. That's part of life. Or you're shifting jobs or you're shifting locations. And every time we sort of disrupt a network of support, a network of belonging, a network of consistency, then I think that does automatically elevate people's risk of struggling to cope, which is that first step on the path.
Mm. And not having sometimes not having control over, your fate and your destiny can be, pretty problematic. And, we're talking about an agricultural pursuit here, and, anyone that involved in some kind of agricultural pursuit knows that you can work as hard as you like, setting up a vineyard, and then a hailstorm's going to come and hit. Yep. So that constant uncertainty must be something that is really difficult to deal with.
Definitely. And I think, if you're in that middle phase of your life, you've got mortgage pressure, you've got financial pressure, you've got retirement. Like I'm thinking 20 odd, I never thought I'd be like, I should plan about my retirement. I'm 25 years out and I'm like, I should plan about retirement. If everything's not going well, you have a massive hailstorm, fires come through, whatever else, like it's just, is that the icing on the cake that time? Or, and like you said, then you reflect back and maybe there were signs before that too. But for some people, there's not, of course. But, you know, when you're at the hands of weather and Mother Nature, then, you know, I guess you've got to be able to try and find ways to ride that uncertainty and ride the high and lows, particularly as a community, because you're all going to be impacted by the same sort of thing.
Are there strategies you can use to sort of build that resilience for when those things come?
I think, resilience is a tricky term because it can individualize a problem in the sense that, you know, if your vineyard was severely hit and you didn't cope too well, was that a reflection of you or is it a reflection of kind of system support? I think it's both. Like, I think you can build resilience by having conversations with people and understanding that this stuff happens and this is how we ride it out. Right? But you can also build resilience by having good community systems in place to support all people who are experiencing that. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach to trying to cope with those sorts of things.
And then you build resilience just by going through shit and coming out the other side of it, and then having that evidence that you somehow got through it last time. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily make it much easier to go through it the next time, but you know that it's possible.
Yeah, you know you came out of it, definitely.
In relation to suicide in regional areas, is there any difference in the prevalence compared to the city?
So I think the city is around kind of 9 people per 100,000. Regional is about 12. And then once you go very remote, it's kind of double the city rate. You know, even though it's a massive issue, the actual count of what happens in really remote areas is quite low. So those estimates are difficult to say they're precise, but definitely the further you are out, the further you are away from not only social support, but actual professional networks of support and healthcare and general services, then, you know, all of that surmounting kind of...
Sort of the perfect storm.
Yeah, perfect storm. And then it takes a hailstorm and you're like...
Too much.
Whatever.
As we spoke about before, one of the major factors is that isolation, and a lot of our listeners will be out working when they're listening to this. What are some things that they can sort of keep an eye on in terms of self-care, like things that might pop up, they might notice that's causing them some distress, or just stuff that's actually noticeable that potentially you might miss, but you should just be keeping an eye on?
One of the things is to kind of be aware of what you do when you're doing well, right? So for me, I get up, if I'm having a good day or if I wake up and I'm in a good mood, I'm singing in the shower. I don't know why. I don't sound good, but I do it.
What are you singing?
Anything. My brain it's constant. It's ADHD, so there's always a random song. Sometimes Whitney Houston. But if I'm not doing that...
It's a terrible joke there, but I won't do it.
If I'm not doing that, it means I'm up here, right? And I think it's the same, like learning what your good days are in terms of your behaviour. Again, not words, but what I do. Do I call a mate? Do I chuck the music on? Do I don't know, throw the ball with the dog, whatever? Versus when I'm not doing well, am I just head down in the vineyard, you know, not listening to anything, just churning away. I'm not listening to music. It's kind of, we've got to start picking up on what changes in you in terms of what you do when you do well and when you don't. And they're the clues that I'm not doing well.
And once we pick up on it, how do we snap out of it? Like, do we decide, right, I'm just going to go, I'm stopping this and I'm going to go throw the ball to the dog right now? Does it work like that? Or?
Man, dogs are awesome. But I think it is about, like, I'm always, you know, when I see someone who's really suffering a lot, not doing very well at all, we kind of think about what's one thing you could do today that would be more helpful than unhelpful, right? And I couch it in the terms of helpful and unhelpful because I don't think there's positives and negatives. There's just things we do at sometimes are helpful and the same thing is unhelpful another time. Mm-hmm. So today, what's one good thing you could do, right? And you can ask yourself that question even when you're not doing so well. When you're really down in the dumps, maybe it is, you know, going into town and getting your lunch and a coffee because you know the person at the bakery or the cafe or the cafeteria, right? And that might be the one thing that's different for you that separates it from the 7 days before where all you did was stood out.
Like a circuit breaker.
Yeah. it's also got to be something that you enjoy, not meaning that when I do it, I'm going to feel better, but it's just typically something I enjoy doing. And it's got to be something that's different in terms of, as I said, the 7 days before, I didn't do any of these things. I like this, I'm going to do that today. So it's like a circuit breaker, but it's really just about, what can I do today that's more helpful? And then tomorrow, what can I do? Maybe I've got a podcast in, or I'm listening to, Jimmy Barnes or some other kind of record I haven't listened to for a long time, because if my brain isn't doing that, right, it's problem solving, like I said before.
And sometimes we can't think our way out of something. It just comes down to taking those little actions. Those are the things that are going to lead us to dragging ourselves out of that bad headspace. And no matter how hard we think about a problem or try to go over it again and again in our head, past a certain point, it just won't get us anywhere compared to just taking a simple action.
Yeah.
And what happens for the person who then recognises that maybe they do need some help but has no idea where to get that help?
Yeah, well, Google is a good thing. And I say that, in a funny way, because even in clinics sometimes when we're working with people and they're like, what can you do in your local area that might, introduce you to new blokes? We're like, let's Google it, right? If there's anything that's ever going to be at your fingertips in terms of information, it's Google. And it goes the same for healthcare. If you're looking up, what do I do? Not feeling the best, what do I do? Google's going to pair you into some result. And you might find, Movember stuff, the Origin stuff. You might find your local directory for mental health services. If you don't have support, do that. If you do have support, and it's support that you feel is strong enough to leverage at least a conversation, then, leverage that. So maybe say to a mate or a partner, I don't feel like I'm doing very well lately. And what are the steps that come about as a result of that conversation? How do we make it happen? I think people who have been there have a role to play. And what I mean by that is, if I said to you, I saw this GP, right? He was really good when we just talked about mental health. I don't have to tell you to go see him, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to remember the GP's name, or you're going to come back to me and say, who was that GP? And it's the same for mental health therapists. A lot of it is kind of word of mouth, where people say, I saw this person and they were really useful, and someone remembers that. And probably better if you're not telling people to go do it. Just talk about it and leave it to them. Just plant the seed, let it sit there. But, think about what can I leverage? Like I said, if I'm not doing well, what can I leverage? Well, one is, as I said, what's something more helpful I can do, right? 2, who can I talk to about it? If you don't have anyone close, there's a lot of support lines, but definitely a GP if possible. And 3, how do I make that happen? Because there's a lot of barriers. Distance is one, cost is another, time is a huge thing for many people. Telehealth is great for the distance issue. I think in many cases people still prefer to come in, particularly for mental health. But there's cases where I see someone face to face and then I might catch them for a few telehealths. And we do that with FIFO workers, for instance. So it's, think about what you do, what you can change, who you can talk to, and then how do I actually implement this? And often that needs, a lot of support from different people. And when we are that person that someone else is coming to and saying, hey, I'm not doing so great, how do we help them? I think, well, 1, check in more regularly, and 2, ask the person how you can help them. Because usually, the first question you'll get is, I don't know, right? Or the first response, sorry. And if you go, well, what are the things we've got to put in place? You often problem solve here. So it might be, do you want me to ring? If you're out on the vineyard all day, do you want me to ring a few places and see who's got availability? I can do that. Do you want me to come with you to the GP and I'll wait in the waiting room, right? Do you want me to whatever else? It's kind of offer suggestions that are based on doing things and helping the individual do things, but also try and, allow that person to, I'll say consent to you doing that and guide what it is they want you to help with. And what about the role of just listening before all that? As a friend? Yeah. Yeah. Well, just listening isn't enough, right? Listening and asking the important questions is what we need to do, because if we just listen and you tell me you're all right, I'm just going to take that, and run with it. So when I do ask you, I've noticed that you're not doing too well and you talk to me, then I have to listen, right? I open that conversation, I need to pay attention to it. And that's when we have to listen well and continue the back and forth around, what can we do about it? Have you thought about doing anything about it? Where would you start? Where would you go?
Yeah, I think sometimes you think you're helping the problem by talking around the problem without ever actually directly addressing it, but you're not necessarily.
What does your experience tell you about that? Like in something you've faced, in a relationship, for example, when you've gone, look, this is a problem here versus dancing around it. Which one works out better? Yeah,
you've got to get to the nub of the matter and sort it out.
And it might be a difficult conversation. Well, it will be a difficult conversation.
Yeah, it's going to come up sooner or later.
Yeah.
And just often preventing it just going to make it worse or for both parties in the end, so you're better off confronting it. But in that moment, neither of you want to.
It's not easy. No. It's really hard.
And it does depend on like the environment and context as well. I think where we have this idea, for example, in construction or agriculture or whatever, where there's lots of blokes around, that they should just get better at talking about that stuff in those environments. And it's like...
Big ask.
Big ask, yeah. I don't know if you've seen a construction site, but everyone's running around like ants, doing stuff. And no one's going to pull you up and have that conversation. And then on a Friday afternoon, going straight to the pub, if you do that, having a few drinks or lemonades, that also may not be the best environment. So we have to think about the when and the where, and also in advance, how are we going to ask about it? What are the things we're noticing, and what's the best way of kind of leading into the conversation to have that?
And one of those questions can often be, are you considering suicide? That can factor into the conversation. I guess you're making a read on how you think this person's going, but that can be a confronting thing for people to ask.
Yeah,
I can't picture myself ever, asking that question.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Oh, yeah, it's just that bit too confronting. I almost think, shit, if we're in this far down the track.
Why is it important to ask that, though, sometimes, Ian?
I think the way I would usually ask it, not in clinic, but with a friend, is, are you feeling safe with yourself, right? Has your mind been giving you some ideas that aren't that great? So you're kind of pointing the torch on it without necessarily picking that exact word up. And if I have never got like a good response around that, then I'll ask directly. But quite often people know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And if you've got a friend, you think isn't doing well and you're close enough, then often, my conversation is always how safe are you feeling with yourself, right? 0's not safe at all and 10's perfectly safe.
Yep.
And if they say I'm 7 out of 10, right, that there's potential unhelpful suicidality in the background, but it's not necessarily actionable at that point. And I think that is one of the things to remember, is just because someone has a thought that maybe this is too hard and, maybe I can make it all go away.
That's not the same as a plan.
That's right. And the statistics are all over the place, but there's some that say, 1 in 3 people at any given time, there's like, 3 of us here today, it might have a thought like that, just because our brain is churning away.
Can you over-engage? Can you make the problem worse by trying to sort of be too helpful?
Yeah. Look, I think if you show up as a support person and you ask a question, and I say, that example before, you've lost your job, you haven't got a job in 3 months, how are you coping? And you're like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Well, I'm always here to have a chat about it if you want, right? But if I keep pushing that issue, then it becomes my agenda and it's not really about you. And what I want to leave it is at a position where, in 2 weeks' time, if you're actually really feeling shit about it, you might pick up the phone to me and go, you know what, I'm not doing too well. So you can talk too much, but I think that the trick is whose agenda is being driven here.
Yeah.
It's the other tricky part of it. It's never your responsibility as the friend or the loved one to save that person or feel like it's your burden, that you're the one, like ultimately we're responsible for ourselves.
Yeah.
I think it probably is our responsibility to check in a reasonable amount and try to be there for that person, tell them that we are there for them.
Yeah.
But you can't actually do a lot more than that. And sometimes that's what can be frustrating, but people have to come to the table themselves and want to be helped.
Yeah. I mean, it is your responsibility to care. Right? And I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about the conversations. If you don't, you're not going to ask. If you do, you're going to ask, and you've got to push it a little bit more. When it comes down to, if I know someone is struggling and I say, can I help you see the GP, or do you want to, see a mental health therapist, or what can I do? And they're like, I don't want to do that. that behavior is their choice. I can only sort of encourage it or water the idea, like a seed, and hopefully it grows over time. But I think that active caring throughout that is what we are responsible for. Yeah. And I think that goes a long way for people.
I think that can be hard too, where you feel like you're the person who's always looking after everyone else, checking in on everyone else, and maybe not looking after yourself enough and giving quite a bit of your own energy, whether that's to having a family member who's got dementia or a mate who's struggling with their mental health, and you're trying to manage those things as well as your job and your life. And maybe that can become overwhelming at a certain point as well, and you have to be able to say, phones work both ways, and it's not actually on me to check in on everybody at all times and just like have the weight of the world on my shoulders either.
Yeah, and I think that example I gave before of what can I do that's helpful today, the flip of that is exactly what you're talking about, right? If I've got a lot going on and I'm not doing too well, then it's actually more unhelpful for me to show up as that person right now. Yeah. And so it isn't something that's going to be particularly, useful for me to do. It's going to be more helpful for me to have the night off and take a break, or talk to someone that I might have a stronger relationship with or whatever. So it
can't help anyone if you're not helping yourself.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But I think you can quickly end up there too if you're the go-to all the time, and if you sound like that sort of mate as well. Yeah. Sometimes you're like,
I totally experienced that myself.
No one asked me.
And you sort of got to draw that line yourself where, I do feel a certain amount of responsibility, but I'm just one man, and I've got my own things that I'm dealing with too. Yeah. And it's a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah. And, that person, you might feel guilty at times, like, I've got to make that call. I've got to go see that person. The reality is like, they'll be there tomorrow in just about every case, and you've got to be able to look after yourself first, as Nick says, in order to be able to help anyone else.
It's even when you want to help someone, let's say in services, like as a mental health professional, who someone calls me and says, can I get in to see? I'm not doing very well. If I can't fit them in, it's distressing at times for me as a therapist, but at the same time, that person's been okay for the last however long, right? They've been managing. So chances are, statistically, they should keep managing as they are. It's not going to be, fun. But that's that point of like, I'm not responsible for you in this exact moment.
Yeah.
Over time, the pattern of behavior is what we care about. But the same as for therapists, like no one ever checks in with us and goes, hey, how are you doing? It's like, we're supposed to be great at it.
Yeah.
You haven't been inside my brain.
Well, that's it. Dealing with other people's problems all the time's got to, get to you after a while.
Well, even your own, it's the same thing, Everyone is in the same boat, and that's an unfortunate reality of the way our brains work, I think.
So going back to basics, self-care, what are some things that we need to make sure we're doing to look after our mental health day to day?
Yeah,
singing in the shower.
Singing in the shower, right? If you're a singer, I'm not a singer. If you're a secret singer like me, and you're not doing that anymore, it's a problem. But I think the key things in terms of mental health, well, at least in the well-being context, and they're sort of two sides of the same coin, is sleep is massively important, right? And sleep doesn't necessarily mean everyone needs 8 hours, right? We're talking about even quality within the sleep window. So staying on top of sleep is really important. And where you're not, like maybe you're not doing too well, you're under a bit more stress, then how can you make that better is one thing. Movement is really important. And I say movement instead of exercise because any kind of physical movement is actually really good for our brains in terms of regulating what's going on up there. So it might just be a stroll, it doesn't have to be a 5K run. It can just be more movement than you've had before. I think that's tricky when you have people who are kind of on their feet all day or in labor industry, where the last thing your body wants to do is exercise.
Yeah.
So, in that context, there's other things you can do. Maybe, you head down to the beach and have a coffee and sit on the jetty. Like there's other things you can do, but sleep, exercise and relationships. Relationships are a massive driver of well-being, and in terms of preventing like mental health distress, building good relationships.
And healthy coping strategies versus unhealthy.
Yeah.
You've had a tough day and come home, it's very easy to reach for a beer.
Yeah.
We all do it, but what can you reach for instead? If you feel like, You know, I'm in a real habit of doing this every night. I don't reckon I can sort of feel it a bit when I'm waking up. It doesn't necessarily make me feel better.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Like I find personally, like abstinence isn't a great solution. Like just nothing.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to do the thing that's supposedly bad or that I think is a problem, and I'm just going to sit here twiddling my thumbs.
Because often it's the process rather than the actual, you know, the object that you're getting for. Yeah.
So, you know, there's like a neurochemical addiction, but there's a behavioural addiction as well. And, you know, I'm an ex-smoker from 20 years ago. I get up in the cold morning and I have my coffee and I'm like,
where's my ciggy?
It's 20 years ago.
And it's still there, yeah.
It's still there. My brain's like, you know, it's just it's like a behaviour. In terms of coping behaviours, no particular behaviour is problematic, right? It's when, like, I like that you said habit, because it's when we get stuck doing the same thing and the same thing isn't working. That's when we have a problem. So, you know, maybe it is going home and you have one beer.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe it's, instead of having 7 or 8, maybe you go home and you do something different. Instead of sitting in front of the TV, maybe you play a board game with your kids. Maybe you build a model aeroplane. Like maybe you pick up guitar and learn some guitar. Maybe you call a friend. It's sort of, if we have space and time,
you got to fill it with something, don't you?
We either do something or we think something. Yep. And I think that's that whole point of, like, I'm not a fan of doing things as a distraction unless it's necessary. Like, if you're distressed, there are times where you need to distract yourself. But if you just distract yourself all the time because you're bored, then you're not investing your time in something good, you know, and I could be doing something more constructive. So for me, you know, if I want to do something different, I'll pick up the guitar. I'll just have a jam.
It takes that extra bit of effort, but it always feels better.
I've got 2 in the lounge room just over there. And I pick them up for a little while and then never.
But every time you do it, you're like, oh, that was great. I'm going to do this every night. And then you don't, because inevitably it's easier to just watch Netflix and have a drink.
Default habit.
And then when you do it again, you're like...
tracky dacks on.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. But I think it's really challenging, especially, you know, you come home from work and you are exhausted. You do just want to veg out. But, you know, sometimes maybe it's a good series you've always wanted to watch. I've never seen Game of Thrones, for instance. But, you know, maybe there's...
plenty of hours there.
Yeah, there's something different, something more helpful, something that you might find interesting.
Rather than just mindless.
Mindless.
And then the other side of that is sometimes mindless is fine. Like,
exactly.
I guess it comes down to, like you said, it's subjective. It's like, how are you coping with it? How's it affecting you? Because something that someone else might have a problem with might be fine for you and vice versa. So it's also not beating yourself up with, tonight I came home and had a drink and watched TV and I'm not going to feel bad about that. That's fine.
But again, it's that, like, is this rigid? Is this predictable?
Yeah.
And I often talk with people about that. I'm like, if you go home tonight and I'm predicting what's going to happen, is it going to look like this, this, and this? And if they're like, yep, so that's a problem. Yeah. Right.
And there are some pretty good non-alcoholic beers out there now.
Definitely.
There's some really good stuff. I'm not sure I'm going to pay $60 for a bottle of non-alcoholic gin, because I think that's kind of pointless. But the beers, there's some really good non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people I've worked with are leveraging that. And that's a good example of where it's a factor outside of the individual that we can modify to help people, for sure.
Any tips for growers to end on, things that particularly stand out? I know we've been through a bunch of stuff, but just anything that comes to your mind that you would want to put in front of our listeners as a closing note?
I think that it's really important to be reflective and tuned into yourself, right? And I think that that's important because that's how we identify when stuff isn't how it used to have been or how we might want it to be. Because if your brain is churning away on those problems, whatever they are, all the time, you're actually not reflecting and you're just following it along, right?
So you said you need to understand what you are when you're good.
Yep.
To know, what you are when you're not.
Yep. But I even think most of us aren't very good at that. So for me, it's kind of, what do you notice when things are better and when things are worse? Because if I'm standing, the example before, standing out in the vineyard and I've been there for 8 hours and all I've done is think all day, and usually I don't do that, and this might be like over a sequence of time, maybe I've been spending too much time in my head.
Yeah.
Right? So being aware of how you change as a result of it in terms of behavior. But also, being aware, I guess, that even though most people aren't very well practiced at having difficult conversations, like most people want to know how you're doing, at the end of the day. And you don't want to be that person that goes out there and all the time you're bringing up this challenge that I'm having. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you are not doing too well, then, you have either mates or you have a partner who's supportive or someone else in the family, then, you can start early conversations around, I don't think I've been doing that well lately. I've noticed I'm not going out anymore, What have you noticed about me? I think it's not always the case that I'm not doing well and now I need to, go into therapy or, I'm suicidal. Like there's that huge grade in between that we touched on right at the start around doing well and doing really unwell, where we need to monitor and shift about within that as best we can.
Ian, I can imagine a situation where, there's someone that is, there's all sorts of pressures on them, pressures beyond their control, sort of business pressures, thoughts that, having had a farm in the family for generations, they might be the generation that loses it. They may not necessarily be feeling depressed in a classical sort of sense, but they're thinking, well, maybe the solution to this problem that's, surrounding me is to take myself out of that problem. And maybe if I end my own life, there's money that comes in as a result of that. That might help save things. That might, make things better for my family. I can't imagine that thinking, but it does happen. Is there some legitimacy to that thinking, or is it always going to create a bigger problem?
There's legitimacy to that thinking if we go back to the problem-solving mind, which, you just leverage, because, this is a big problem. If you think about someone who's got a, business that's struggling, be it agriculture or whatever else, and there's financial pressure and other issues, then this is a big relevant problem to a person. And the brain is going to come up with lots of different ways to solve it. Sometimes we're just naturally drawn to what might seem like the fastest way, right? Because maybe it's under the assumption that it's easier for everyone. But I think what happens in that context is we go down a very single solution approach. Like this is the only solution. But usually, the brain has like a smorgasbord of options here. And just like, you go to the breakfast buffet at a hotel and you're like, I could have any of this stuff, but for me, I'll always go for a hash brown, right? Yeah. It's like the same sort of thing. It's like, let's pick that option. And I think when someone is in that space, you've got to kind of step back and go, well, what are the other solutions, right? In terms of the problem, but also in relation to, suicide, well, what actually is important to me? Is family, if you've got a good family, connectedness, showing up and, pushing through adversity, like what values are important to you as a person, and are you in contact with those and are you living those out? And I've been down the track where people have been very actively considering, hurting themselves, and it's often because they've lost sight of these other factors. And so I think absolutely people can get there where we're talking about a single solution, but the reality is not only does it leave a massive fallout for people, and I've worked with people who are directly affected by suicide.
No one's ever made anyone's life better by ending their own. 100%.
And I always think if the individual that had died by suicide could sit in that therapy room and listen to what someone who's affected by it has to say, like there's
the funeral.
There's a definite disconnection there, where, maybe you have a son or a daughter or a partner or whatever, the absolute grief, absolute grief that those people go through following suicide. I'm sure they would, for many people, do all of the things your brain says they won't want to do, like sell up, sell the house, move, I don't know. 9 times out of 10,
they would do all those things to have you back.
All of those things to have you here.
Great advice. Thanks so much, mate.
No worries, man. Thanks for the chat.
Thanks for listening. Head to the Wine Grape Council of South Australia website for links and further resources. This is part of a bigger conversation, so feel free to share this podcast with your mates and look after yourselves. Cheers.